the story really begins with my father, I think, and being raised in Riverside with a father who was an invalid. And I have to say is that he was a mystery to me then, and he's a mystery to me now. I still do not know very much about him. I know he graduated from Stanford. I knew he'd been raised in a wealthy home in Pasadena. I knew he'd gone to Culver Military Academy. I knew he had this background of a family that owned land and were very prosperous in early Los Angeles. I knew that much because of the remnants that were in the house. But he wouldn't talk about it. In fact, it was a real denial on his part that there was any history. He purposely had strong feelings about the past than what it had given him, and bitter, I would say. But then he was also very ill with heart disease and whatever. So when he passed, I really didn't know very much about the family until I started doing research. And I started about 15 years ago, and then I really got into it about 6 years ago. And this is the story that I've uncovered. So, I mean, I'm really excited about it. It's very interesting because it tells a lot about Los Angeles. So I guess I'll start talking about my great-great-grandfather. My great-great-grandfather was Luther H. Titus, and Luther was raised out of Buffalo in a small town actually called Abbott's Corner. It's now it's changed its name, and of course it's Orchard Park, and it's he was raised in that area, and he mined for lead in Galena, Illinois during the mining boom of that time, and he began to buy property even then. And then in 1849 he struck out for the gold rush. So he became a part of the enormous massive movement of people, fortune hunters and whatever, and he wrote a diary, and that's where I started writing this history. He had already been married, and he had one daughter, and that was my great-grandmother. Her name was Mary Titus. And he left and came out, struck it rich, and went back to Buffalo area, and he built a beautiful brick mansion, and they stayed there for 17 years. And he raised my great-grandmother, Mary Titus, and he raised her sister, Clara Titus. And in 1869, Mary had married a man from the area, returning captain from the Civil War. And that's an interesting story, too, about his adventures in the Civil War and his family. But anyway, they had been married for 2 years, or maybe a year and a half, and Luther came back to California, and that's the most exciting part of all. So in 1869, they packed up the family, my great-great-grandmother, Maria Titus, and the family, the Newtons, Mary Newton and her husband, Jacob Newton, and Clara Titus, her sister, and they came around the Horn in 1869 and arrived in Los Angeles area. And as that time...
Can I have you sit up?
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, that's better. I'm getting over to...
Just, try and, that's good. Just in another chair.
Okay, good. All right.
You can lean over this way a little bit.
But not hang over the side.
Uh-huh.
Okay, we can continue.
So where they came to California.
Right, they came to the San Gabriel Mission area, and if you think about it, in 1870, for instance, the population in Los Angeles was 15,333 people. Then, of course, by 1880, it had already grown to 33,000, and but it's a far cry from San Francisco, which was already a booming town, and probably close to 150,000 at that time. But Los Angeles was a frontier town, and they settled near the mission, I believe, because there wasn't a lot of population, and they would gravitate to where the population was. So they bought a land. My great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather started buying land, and that's what they did. But one other thing I've uncovered is they also bought land in downtown Los Angeles, and that was kind of fun. The story and the family story goes that he brought $25,000 in gold coins when he came out to California around the Horn, and that's the money they used. They started buying in the Los Angeles, the central Los Angeles area. They bought on a street called Fort Street. It was originally spelled Fortin. And most of the streets in downtown were Spanish names, of course, because of the Spanish Americans that lived here and the Californio families that lived here, and that's how they got their name. And it was all residential. That's another interesting part. You know, Main Street was commercial. They had shops and whatever, but the outlying areas, 410 Street, which later became Fort Street, which later became Broadway, between 2nd and 3rd, he bought for $3,800 gold coins. He bought about 6 lots. Later he was to sell 3 of the lots to the city for the city hall for $58,000, and that became the first city hall in Los Angeles, but that's much later. And this time he did live in a short period in that time. They had like a townhouse and a farmhouse. My great-grandfather, meanwhile, Jacob Newton and Mary Newton, had a farmhouse out in El Sereno and later into the area which is now South Pasadena. But they, my grandmother was born in 1867, I believe, and her sister later followed. The original Clara Titus is kind of interesting. Clara, Mary's sister, Clara Titus, became a nun in 1890, and she died at 43, and there's really very little known about her. There are no pictures or whatever. I do know she was a teacher, and you know, she joined this convent, and that was her life. But anyway, back to Mary Titus and her family. Mary was, I would imagine, a very ambitious woman, and I think how she showed her ambition was through her daughter, Clara. And so they were raised in the farm environment. They were raising racehorses, by the way. That was interesting. They imported these very famous Hambletonian racehorses that were very fine, and it was the envy of everyone and the ranches around, and all the biographies speak about these racehorses that arrived, and everyone went down to see them come off the Pacific Electric train and whatever. So anyway, they raised these racehorses because my great-grandfather became the director of Agricultural Park, where Exposition is it was a racetrack. It was the original racetrack. Started, I think about, well, I'd have to say in the 1870s, maybe 1871, and it was by the prominent families in Los Angeles. And if you think about it, gambling's always been a pleasure or a recreation, and you know, where did you gamble at that time was at the racetrack, and that's what they did. There was bordellos all around the racetrack, and the longest bar in Los Angeles. But anyway, there was a period, it was very interesting, is that my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather took their 2 daughters. My grandmother was Clara, and she was 13 at the time, and they returned to their home, the brick mansion, which was in western New York, and they lived for 2 years. I suspicion it was because my great-great-grandmother had never adjusted to living in California. She was very unhappy here. There's also a mystery about her as well, in the sense that there are no pictures. The only thing we know is she had red hair and she supposedly was a shrew. But my suspicion is that she was actually mentally ill. And I think this because as I put my family story together, I realized that through every generation there seems to follow that one of the women is affected, and it affects only the women, that they're mentally ill and is diagnosed now as schizophrenia. But at that time, when I started doing the research, I had very little knowledge. The only knowledge I had is that I had a sister who returned from the Second World War and had a breakdown and later was institutionalized, and it was a heartbreak for the family, and living with it I did experience. But I have another sister who has a daughter, and her daughter has been diagnosed as schizophrenia. And she's medicated now and lives in the regular world, but in a sheltered situation so that she's monitored and whatever. But when I was about in the 1980s rather, about 1984, we received a notice that my my aunt it was, my father's sister. He had one sister, and we received notice that she had died without a will, and an air finder found us. And when he came to us, he found all this wealth in these safety deposit boxes. They found $90,000 in one, $40,000 in another. It was all over. And of course, the only time I ever remember this aunt of mine is when she would arrive at our house, my father being an invalid, and they would have this terrible arguments and whatever. It was after my grandmother had passed away. And I realized that that somehow this aunt had been estranged, and after that period, she was never heard from again. So I really didn't know what had happened to her, except that they had found that she had died, and the air finder took 1/3 of the whatever was there, and all these relatives came out. We all got $10,000, I think, is what finally it came down to, because it was divided up so many ways. But I was very curious because I really didn't know very much about her or anything about it. But what I did know is that my mother said, "I wonder what happened to the bag of diamonds from Tiffany's." So I began to research the banks and find out what happened, and the state holds them today. I couldn't prove that we were the actual descendants, that she was the one. I mean, it's very, but it did lead me to find out where she was living and where she was married, and what I found out is that she was eventually institutionalized as schizophrenic. So there's another one. So anyway, this is all part of the story.
We have about maybe 8 minutes left.
How much?
On the statements, okay. Okay.
Okay,
I'll
so,
give you a little tap when we get to about 3.
okay. So going back to this story, which is all part of the possibly the sorrow and the secrets my father wished to hide from us, as parents often do because of the pain. I'll say is that when they lived for the 2 years back in Erie County, my grandmother and my great-grandmother, and my grandmother was 13, and my great-grandmother took possession of the house, and my great-great-grandmother, Mariah Titus, eventually died there, and that's the end of her story, but in 1901. But my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather returned to Los Angeles, and they bought a home on the corner of Figueroa and Adams in the West Adams area, 4 blocks from where we're living now, which is another story in itself. And while they did, my grandmother went to USC. The interesting thing, now we're talking about the 1880s, and you remember there's 33,000 people living in Los Angeles. In 1880, they started the USC, University of Southern California, and in 1889, when she was a freshman, there were 47 students in the College of Liberal Arts, and she was one of 21 freshmen. It was $20 a term, and you had to be fluent in Greek and Latin, and it was really a very rigid, very difficult curriculum, but she completed her freshman year, and then she went to Emerson College in Boston and finished her second year. And by that time, they'd moved to downtown Los Angeles again on Olive Street near 2nd and 3rd, which is the top of Angel's Flight. And the family held the land until the 1940s, I found out by looking at land records. And my grandmother eventually built a big hotel there. She called it the New Meriton, after Newton, my father, and Mary May, my aunt. So anyway, back to, after she graduated from Emerson, she came back to Los Angeles, and my grandfather, she had met my grandfather, and they had started a correspondence, which is a series of love letters, which I found stored away in our famous secretary that came around the horn in 1869. And there, in that series of letters, I unfold a story about my grandfather. I had no idea. He died in his 50s before I was born. And he was a lawyer. He graduated summa cum laude from Boston University, practiced law up in San Francisco, and he was an idealist. He belonged to the Populist Party. He was a public speaker by profession. He loved to do that. He entered every competition. And he talks about the politics in San Francisco and how this populist party was the answer because it was anti-monopoly. It was money for the people, and he was running on a ticket for district attorney. William Jennings Bryan eventually ran for president under this same ticket. But the interesting thing to me is that he is having a courtship with my grandmother, and of course my grandmother is an heiress, owning tremendous amount of land and prominent family. They had by this time built a big mansion in South Pasadena. She had been queen, or not queen, but she was a princess in the first Los Angeles fiesta. They were beautiful, she and her sister. They were amazingly beautiful and quite accomplished, having graduated from a college. So here she was, and she was going to marry this man who was this idealist. But as so often happens with idealists, he lost the election and he was crushed. He was so ambitious, this man. He was a self-made man from a small town in Iowa. He graduated summa cum laude, become a prominent lawyer, and this was more than he could handle. So he came down to Los Angeles. They did marry. There were 800 at the wedding. The entire front of the mansion was covered with a tent. It's a beautiful description of a gorgeous wedding with the governor and the mayor and all the prominent people of the time. And this is 1895. After 1895, they had my father, which is Newton, and his last name is Cattern, because that's Frank Cattern was the lawyer, and my aunt. And they went on to the Chautauqua Circuit. And the Chautauqua Circuit is located out of Chautauqua, New York, and it was the prominent theater of the time. It was the news broadcasters. It brought information, it brought culture to the Midwest and the South and the Far East. It was very famous, as it is today, by the way. And he became the director, and I think it was their happiest years. But as things happen, first of all, my great-great-grandfather died, and the property began to be passed down and around. Then soon after, my great-grandmother died, Mary Titus Newton. And Clara rushed home to begin to the court battle to take possession of the property away from my great-grandfather. And I have the newspaper articles and whatever. They wanted to declare him incompetent. So she and her sister fought over who was going to possess, the holdings or the responsibility for this man. Well, as it turned out, he passed away. And my as I uncovered more and more history, I realized that my grandmother and my grandfather lived separately. My grandfather was, I think, abusive to my father. And as it turns out, as I uncovered more and more land history, I realized that my father gave all the land away. He signed everything away. He gave everything away. And I guess he thought in his silence that this story was too bitter. It's too sad. It's too full of sorrow. It's full of people wanting everything and being greedy. It's full of ambition. And yet there's an underlying sadness that with all these possessions and with all the things that they had, that somehow, what was the meaning of life? And he felt, I believe this, is he felt that life should be lived simply, and that life was about doing good to man and being humble. And that's what he talked about all the time. So that's the story.
That was wonderful. That was wonderful.